I'm the elected sheriff of a county most people only pass through. 2 highways cross a basin of cottonwoods, low houses, and wind-chewed fields. In winter the days shorten so quickly they seem embarrassed, slipping away before you notice. That year we had more ice than snow, a thin glaze on everything. We share a radio channel with the state patrol and the reservation police to the north, so when a call goes out at night it carries a certain gravity. On paper I supervise things. In practice, at 2 in the morning, I am just another pair of headlights cutting the dark. Dispatch said a motorist had found a person down near mile marker 214, no movement, unknown injuries. The caller was shaken, short on details. I asked about traffic. None, they said. That stretch is straight as a ruler with wheat stubble on both sides, not the kind of place where drunks stumble out of bars. I notified the deputy on duty, a kid named Alvarez, and I took the long road anyway. Nights have a way of shrinking the distances on a map. You start to feel the edges curling in. The motorist waited with hazard lights blinking, a pulsing red reflection across the ice. He stood outside his truck with his hands jammed in his armpits, grateful to hand the scene to someone in uniform. 30 yards beyond him, at the edge of the roadway, lay a man on his side. No tire tracks leading to him. No footprints walking away. Just the wind scoring the surface. Alvarez arrived 2 minutes after me, siren off, spotlight tracing the field like we expected it to answer. We worked it the way you're trained. Approach slow. Call out. Establish whether help is possible. From 5 feet, I could see the man was beyond any aid I could render. Mid-30s, maybe, beard grown in unevenly, jacket zipped up to his throat. No blood I could see in the patrol beams. What I noticed instead was absence. The car's light cast our silhouettes long across the ice, stretched and warped. The man on the ground had none. The light struck him and then went nowhere, as if it declined to follow his shape. I blinked like a fool. Then I stepped to the side, watching how the beams shifted. My shadow walked with me, dutiful and dark. His did not exist. Alvarez said my name, low and uncertain. I heard the motorist shuffle on the gravel as if he felt it too, but couldn't say it. Training is a rope you grip when the river takes your feet, so I kept to it. I checked for a pulse, though I knew there wouldn't be one. Skin was cold as the fender. Protocol required we clear the area and lock it down until the coroner arrived. I told the motorist he could wait in his truck, heater on. The night was too big for him anyway. Alvarez ran the plates on the man's wallet ID when we found it. Local address, nothing remarkable. A receipt in his pocket from a gas station an hour south time stamped 60 minutes earlier. The coroner, Dr. Hahn, took 40 minutes to reach us. Night gathers slow when all you have for company is questions you can't ask out loud. Hahn crouched with the steadiness of a man who has forgotten more bodies than I will ever see. He spoke little. That's why I trust him. He checked what needed checking, then signaled for the gurney. When the scene lights shifted for a moment, I saw it again, or rather, I saw nothing where something should have been. The body blocked the wind, but not the light. Hahn must have noticed my attention lingering. He asked if I was all right. I said yes because I didn't know how to describe what I wasn't seeing. We photographed the area, marked what little there was to mark, loaded the deceased, and headed back ahead of the wrecker. On the drive in, the radio stayed conspicuously silent. In the morgue's fluorescent brightness, I expected the spell to break, if that's even the word. But even under flat overhead light, I found myself glancing at the floor, searching for a line of darker tone that never appeared. A camera is supposed to be more honest than the eye. I asked Alvarez to print the first roll in black and white. Officially, it was nothing unusual. Exposure. Maybe a medical event. We canvassed the gas station and learned he'd filled up, spoken politely, paid cash. The clerk liked him, which is not something that makes its way into forms. His family said he went for night drives to clear his head, and that sounded as reasonable as anything. But in my report, even as I typed the words, I could feel the itch of omission. I described the scene lights, the weather, the time. I did not mention the absence I couldn't prove. I told myself it was an artifact of angle, or that the ice was reflective enough to erase contrast. A reasonable mind will always build a bridge over a gap, even when you shouldn't cross. Still, I kept catching myself watching my own shadow as I moved through the building, checking that it stayed put. That was the first night. If the story ended there, I could file it away with the weather reports. But it didn't. What happened next is where the ground and the map parted company for good. I went home near dawn, boots thawing on the mat while the kettle hissed. My wife was asleep, and I didn't wake her. I sat at the table without turning on the kitchen light, letting the first gray seep in. It struck me that I could not remember the dead man's face clearly, only the outline where a shadow ought to have been. I told myself to get some rest. I didn't at all. Ever. Sleep didn't come that morning. I lay there with my eyes closed, listening to the furnace cycle and the house creak, and I kept seeing that faint spill of light across the ice. There is a particular silence you only hear in winter. It isn't peaceful. It's more like the world has paused a breath longer than it should. By midday, I gave up pretending to rest and went back to the office, letting the rhythm of paperwork do its work. Routine is a scaffold. You lean on it even when you know it won't hold. Alvarez was already there, clicking through the photographs he'd printed. He didn't say anything at first, just slid the stack toward me. The dead man's name looked strange on the evidence tags, both familiar and hollow. In the images, the body lay in the same position I remembered, the light falling from the cruiser beams. I felt relief catch in my throat as soon as I noticed it. The photographs showed nothing unusual. The shadows were shallow, diffuse, but present. His jacket, the folds of fabric, the line of his arm. There were dark areas where there should be. For a moment that made me feel foolish, like a child insisting a shape in the dark had teeth. But the longer I looked, the more I realized I wasn't reassured at all. There was a difference between looks normal and matches memory, and the two weren't shaking hands. In the field, the absence had been total. In the prints, there was enough contrast to insist everything was ordinary. I told Alvarez it was fine work and thanked him. He watched my face as if he were waiting for me to say something else. When I didn't, he nodded and went about his business with more deliberation than necessary. We notified the family, organized the small necessities that surround a death, and the days moved forward in their uneven winter fashion. If you'd asked me then what was wrong, I couldn't have placed it. It came on as a series of little hesitations in the mind. I would walk the hallway past the interview room, see my shadow drift along the floor ahead of me, and feel the slightest urge to look twice. I would bend to sign a form and have the impression that I took longer to appear on the tile than I should have. Never anything dramatic. Just enough to make me wonder which sense to trust. I didn't mention it to my wife. Marriage doesn't entitle a person to every passing worry. And besides, I didn't have a language for it that wouldn't sound theatrical. Sometimes light behaves wrong around me is not a sentence you offer in a quiet kitchen without consequences. Instead, I kept my counsel and watched the world more carefully, as if reality were a suspect I wasn't ready to question. 2 nights after the highway call, I was on patrol with the radio low, letting the murmur of distant units keep me company. The roads were empty in the way that feels personal, like the county has turned its back to you. A mile south of town, I saw a lone figure standing by the ditch, shoulders hunched. I slowed, ready to check their welfare, and angled the spotlight. The beam found nothing. Not they stepped away. Not I misjudged the distance. Nothing. Just dry weeds, frozen stiff. I sat there with my turn signal clicking, an absurd metronome for the thought that maybe I'd imagined someone entirely. The human eye is not above embellishment. I reminded myself of that and drove on. The next morning, Dr. Han called. His voice is the same regardless of topic, a plain spoken steady current. He said the autopsy showed cardiac failure consistent with exposure and stress. There were small anomalies in the blood work that he chalked up to dehydration. Nothing criminal. Nothing that would trouble a grand jury. He didn't invite questions, and I didn't offer any. We ended the call on professional terms. I stayed at my desk staring at the blank space on the blotter, where my shadow should have been if the overhead light had been a little brighter. About a week after the death, the family asked to collect personal effects. I met them in the lobby because it felt wrong to delegate. Grief arrives in shapes you learn to recognize: anger, numbness, the brittle politeness of people doing their best. This was the last one. The brother thanked me, hand light as paper in mine. He asked a simple question, whether we knew exactly where his brother had been headed that night. I said the truth: no. He studied my face for a beat too long, like he hoped I'd remember something else if he waited. When he turned to leave, his shadow lay clear and dark on the linoleum. For a second, the outline seemed to hesitate before following him, as if there were a lag between body and evidence. That was the first time I felt a kind of internal click, a recognition that this wasn't going to resolve into a story I could close. I began to reread reports from the last few years, looking for strange echoes. Wrong head counts after search and rescue drills. Patients who swore a nurse had been in their room when no one had. A fisherman who said the water swallowed reflections differently on certain nights. None of it pointed anywhere on a map. It just hummed in my head like a low current. Alvarez came into my office one afternoon and shut the door behind him. He stood there for a moment, collecting his words. Finally he said that when he looked at the photographs long enough, he had the sense that the shadow under the patrol car was darker than under the man. He laughed after he said it, embarrassed, like he was admitting to a superstition. I told him there are worse things to notice than details. We let the subject dissolve on its own, rather than forcing it to conclusion. One evening, near shift change, I walked across the lot toward my cruiser, and the sun was low enough to make of the county a theater of silhouettes. Every object threw a long-reaching copy of itself across the gravel. I looked down to find mine, and felt something quiet unspool when I didn't see it for half a second. Then it appeared, ordinary as ever, and I could almost hear my mind sanding the edges off the moment. That is how it worked. 1,000 small splinters you sand down so they won't catch. The mind wants a story with clean lines. He died. We did our duty. The world carried on. But sometimes, late at night, I'd think of the prints in their neat folder and the way they contradicted the truth of my own eyes, and I would wonder which version of the world had the better claim on me. After a while, that wondering stopped feeling like curiosity and started feeling like weather, something you live under, whether or not you approve. It was late January when the second call came in, and by then I'd managed to convince myself that whatever had unsettled me was a trick of fatigue and light. Winter will do that. It stretches the nights until they fray, and you start to imagine seams where there aren't any. The call was dispatched as a welfare check at an abandoned grain elevator outside of town. Kids like to drink there sometimes, though kids in our reports ranged in age from 17 to men who should have known better by 40. I drove out with the heater complaining, tires whispering over the packed snow. The elevator sits alone on the edge of nothing in particular, just a tower of corrugated metal with a few outbuildings slouched beside it. No power. No houses close enough to hear anything. The sky had a thin scattering of stars, and the moon was a pared-down sliver, too small to be of use. My headlights swept over the siding, and everything looked exactly as neglected as it should. A pickup was parked crooked near the loading dock, engine off, windows fogged. I parked behind it at an angle the way they teach you and walked up slow. There was a young man sitting in the driver's seat. He wasn't drunk. His eyes had that hollow look people get when they've already thought too hard about something. He said he was fine, just needed to sit. I asked him if he'd been with friends, whether anyone else was inside. He shook his head. I don't consider myself suspicious by nature, but something in his voice had that brittle pitch of someone forcing normal. He stared straight ahead while he spoke, like if he turned his head, the world would rearrange itself behind him. I shone my light across the open bay. In the beam of the flashlight, the dust drifted like slow weather. I took a few steps inside. The boards creaked. Old rope hung from the ceiling, and the smell was of mice and old grain. When I turned, the young man was watching me now, expression blank. But what pulled at my attention was the way the light from my cruiser fell over him. The steering wheel cast a clear half circle on his chest. His arm made a thin, dark line across the seat. But his head cast nothing. It was as if from the neck up, the light declined to acknowledge him. I didn't say anything. I backed out and stood between the buildings for a moment, letting the night settle around me. There are times your body reacts before your mind agrees to understand. I realized I'd been holding my breath and let it out slow, watching the vapor curl away. When I came back, everything looked normal again. The line of his jaw, the brim of his cap, shadows where they should be. He asked if he could go. I told him to head home. As he pulled away, his taillight stitched a red thread through the dark, then disappeared beyond the slope. I stood there longer than I needed to, listening to the wind thread the metal seams. The silence around that place felt layered, as if beneath the ordinary quiet there was another stillness holding its breath. Eventually, procedure reasserted itself. I swept the buildings, found nothing more interesting than a rusted can and an old jacket left behind. The report I wrote later was perfunctory. Subject located, no assistance required. I didn't mention the moment of wrongness because I couldn't articulate it without also indicting myself as unreliable. People think being sheriff is about decisiveness. Most days it's about living with partial information and then going home to make dinner. I tried to let the night pass through me the way all the other nights had, but the mind holds on, like a dog worrying at a thread. The next morning, I stopped by Dr. Han's office on an unrelated matter and found myself asking, casually as I could, whether he'd ever noticed optical phenomena under fluorescent light, delays in shadow, that sort of thing. He tilted his head and said he hadn't, though he had seen families insist on details that contradicted records. Memory, he said, is not admissible evidence except when it has to be. He smiled mildly, then returned to his notes. The conversation left me feeling both foolish and faintly reassured, which is an odd combination. A week later, Alvarez and I were reviewing dashcam footage for a training request. As the videos rolled silently, the same highway and parking lots playing over and over, I found myself watching not the suspects or the traffic stops but the darkness between them. I noticed, without meaning to, that in certain frames the light seemed to soft pedal around people, as if reluctant to commit. Sometimes the effect vanished on the next frame. Sometimes it lingered a breath too long. I didn't point it out. I wasn't sure there was anything to point to that would survive being said aloud. The county fairgrounds sit empty in winter. Just metal barracks of animal stalls and a grandstand that looks foolishly optimistic under snow. I like to walk there on my off days. It's quiet in a way that feels honest. One afternoon, near dusk, I paced the track with my hands in my pockets and watched my shadow lengthen ahead of me. As I walked, I noticed the outline of my head seemed a fraction smaller than it should have been. Not gone. Just hesitating. The next lap it was fine again. There's a temptation at moments like that, to laugh at yourself, to defuse the charge. I didn't. I just kept walking and let the thought lodge wherever it wanted. We had a small missing person case around, then a woman in her 60s who liked to wander the back roads at odd hours. We found her a mile from home, sitting on a culvert, her coat buttoned wrong. She was polite and lucid enough. When I asked if she was cold, she said, "Only where the light touches me." I don't know why that sentence bothered me so much. People say strange things every day. She smiled when she said it, like it was a private joke with the sky. It was around that time that I started to notice how unpredictable reflections could be. In shop windows, sometimes I'd catch the frame of my body crisp, and then, just for a blink, my head would appear half a beat later, like a voice arriving out of sync. The first time it happened, I turned sharply and almost knocked over a display of fishing lures. The clerk asked if I needed help. I said no and heard the flatness in my own voice. I could feel a narrative beginning to build, and I resisted it the way you resist an undertow, stepping sideways instead of straight back. You don't want to give shape to something until you're sure it deserves one. But the mind is a pattern-finding animal. It will lay stones in the dark to make a path whether or not it leads anywhere safe. And the path, as far as I could tell, led back to that winter night on the highway, to a body lying still while the light refused to mark its existence. When you're responsible for other people's safety, your own uncertainty feels like a private failure. So I kept working, kept showing up, kept signing my name where it needed to go. At night though, I found myself replaying scenes in my head, checking whether the shadows had behaved the way they were supposed to. Sometimes I realized I'd misremembered entirely. Sometimes I realized I didn't trust either version. There is a line thin, invisible between vigilance and obsession. I had not crossed it yet, but I could see it in the distance, like a fence wire through frost. And in the quiet hours, I began to suspect that whatever had gone wrong in the world, that winter had not gone wrong all at once. It had simply slipped a fraction of an inch out of alignment, and my job, for better or worse, had put me in a position to notice. The first time I caught myself checking for my shadow in a mirror rather than on the floor, it struck me as funny in a grim sort of way. The mirror in my office is small, the kind you hang up mostly out of habit, a leftover from some previous administration. I stood there late one evening with the hall lights off, just my desk lamp burning, and for a moment my reflection seemed thinner than I was, more suggestion than substance. Then it settled, as if my outline had been tugged gently into place by invisible hands. You could call that imagination. You could call it fatigue. There wasn't a word for what it felt like, which was simply wrong. I didn't tell anyone. The job trains you to separate private perceptions from public realities. If you can't do that, you won't last long. But I started to wonder whether others were noticing similar fractures and simply choosing, as I had, not to speak. People can get along with all kinds of quiet distortions, as long as the groceries still ring up and the mail arrives. In early March, snow melt gathered in the ditches like strips of tarnished glass. We received a call from the reservation police to assist with a missing hunter. He'd gone out alone before dawn and hadn't come back. We coordinated through the usual channels, a mixture of goodwill and careful respect. I drove north with Alvarez and 2 volunteers. The land up there unrolls in long waves, pine-rimmed ridges and muskeg flats, the mountains distant and indifferent. We staged from a maintenance yard and fanned out along a section line, radios clicking in our ears. Searching for someone is an act of attention. You don't look for a person so much as for disruptions, tracks in places that shouldn't have them, broken reeds, a glove or a scrap of fabric. We found faint snowshoe impressions following a tree lean and then turning east. 2 hours in, one of the volunteers radioed that he saw movement ahead. We converged and came upon the hunter sitting against a stump, eyes open, breathing slow and shallow. He looked not scared, not relieved, just absent, as if his mind had folded itself away somewhere warmer. Medical checked him, found him hypothermic but stable. When he finally spoke, his voice was dusty with disuse. He said he'd stopped to rest and then realized he couldn't tell whether it was night or day anymore. I asked if he'd seen anything unusual. He shook his head. Only the way the light bent wrong, he said softly, as if embarrassed by the poetry of it. We helped him up. As he stood, I saw the faint play of sunlight across the snow, and for a fraction of a second, he stood without a shadow at all, like a cut-out figure glued onto the world. Then the dark shape slid back under him, obedient again. The others didn't react. I thought of speaking, then didn't. We walked him back through the pines, our boot steps creaking in the cold. The radios murmured. Everything worked the way it was supposed to, and yet. I drove home that night in a mood I can only describe as careful. I moved slowly, as if sudden movements might startle whatever fragile arrangement kept the world in one piece. At home, my wife asked how the search went, and I told her the essentials. The man was found, he would recover. She asked if I was all right. I said yes, and the truth of the answer felt smaller than the question deserved. We don't talk much about the ways the job seeps into your thinking. You begin to take inventory, almost subconsciously. How many people in a room, where the exits are, whether a story makes clean sense. Lately, those inventories had begun to feel unreliable. In staff meetings, I would count the deputies at the table, then find myself counting again, because the number refused to stay attached to the faces. 4, then 5, then 4 again. Always resolving, always normal when you looked straight at it. But the uncertainty lingered like an afterimage. One afternoon, I walked into the jail wing, and the trustee mopping the floor looked up at me with a strange expression. He said, "For a second, I thought you were two people." Then he laughed, embarrassed, as if he'd said something foolish. I smiled to let him off the hook, but the words hung in the air long after he'd moved on. I found myself glancing at the blank cinder-block wall, half expecting to see a delay between me and my reflection where none existed. The town carried on. Basketball tournaments, church potlucks, a rash of catalytic converter thefts that kept us busy for a week. Ordinary life is a powerful stabilizer. It insists on itself. But when the sun dipped behind the water tower and the long winter twilight stretched out, I would sometimes catch sight of my shadow bending across the courthouse lawn and feel, with a clarity I could not explain, that it was not quite mine. Not separate, not alive, just adjacent somehow, as if light had made a best guess and hoped I wouldn't notice the imprecision. Around then, I began to revisit my original report from the night of the body. I opened the file late, after everyone had gone home, the building humming softly like an animal at rest. The language was neat, restrained, the product of a man who believed reality would reward precision. I read it twice and felt as if I were reading someone else's memory. Details I would have sworn to were not there. Others seemed overly confident. I could not decide whether the document had changed or I had. I called Dr. Hahn under the pretense of checking on unrelated paperwork. We made small talk. Just before hanging up, he mentioned something offhand. When he'd prepared the body for release, he'd noticed how the overhead light in the lab left the area beneath the gurney oddly pale, as if shadows had thinned. He didn't linger on it. He is not a man given to fanciful observations. He simply said it and then moved on to scheduling, leaving me to sit there with the phone warm in my hand. Driving home that evening, I noticed how the street lamps cast soft cones of light onto the snowbanks. In each pool of illumination, there was the suggestion of presence and absence, neither fully committing. As I pulled into my driveway, my headlights swept the front of the house, and for one clean, undeniable instant, the beam passed over my porch chair, and the chair did not cast a shadow at all. Just light and object, no intermediary. Then, as if remembering itself, the darkness bloomed back into place. I sat in the car with the engine idling, hands resting on the wheel, and I realized that my heartbeat felt like it belonged to someone else. Not in a dramatic sense. Just slightly misaligned, like a clock in need of adjustment. I turned off the ignition and listened to the engine tick as it cooled, each sound locating itself in space with precise obedience. The world was consistent again. The illusion of control returned like a coat shrugged back onto my shoulders. There is a temptation, when you find yourself at the edge of what you can explain, to go looking for larger stories, conspiracies, patterns, explanations that would gather all the stray fragments into one coherent whole. I resisted that temptation with every tool I had. I believe in evidence. I believe in testimony. I believe in the quiet dignity of not knowing everything. And yet, the image of that body on the roadside without a shadow lingered like a bruise you forget about until you bump it against a doorway. By the end of March, I had come to accept a simple, unnerving premise. Either the world had briefly behaved in a way I did not understand, or my perception had. Both possibilities felt equally isolating. And isolation, I've learned, doesn't always come from being physically alone. Sometimes it comes from realizing that what you see, or fail to see, cannot be safely shared. Still, I woke each morning, put on the uniform, pinned the badge, and went out into a county that trusted me to know what was real. And most days I did. Most days, the shadows fell where they should. April came with a kind of brittle hope, mud on the shoulders of the highway, migratory birds drifting back in loose, uncertain formations. The town thawed slowly, and with the thaw came the small, familiar troubles of spring. Flooded basements, arguments over fence lines revealed again after months under snow. I found the return to ordinary grievances almost comforting. Routine folds over strangeness the way a blanket hides a sharp corner in a room. But there was a part of me that had become habitually watchful, a quiet tally keeper. The shadows followed us out of winter like silent witnesses. I noticed it most in transitional light, in the gray before sunrise, in the low amber of early evening. People would walk across a parking lot, and, just for a moment, the dark shape on the pavement seemed uncertain of its owner, as though it had to think about where to attach itself. Then, invariably, the effect would resolve. Still, my mind recorded each hesitation and added it to the ledger I pretended not to keep. One evening, I was called to a minor accident outside of town, a single vehicle slide into a shallow ditch. Nobody was hurt. A young woman stood by the road, wrapped in a blanket provided by a passerby. She was embarrassed more than anything else. We filled out forms together, straightforward as you please. When she signed her name on the report, her hand made a neat, practiced motion. Then she paused, looked down at the paper, and asked, very quietly, "Sheriff, do you ever feel like something is following a little behind you?" She smiled awkwardly after she said it, but the question didn't sound whimsical. It sounded careful. I asked what she meant. She shook her head. Nothing. Just lack of sleep, probably. We finished up, and I watched her climb into a tow truck cab, her profile calm and ordinary against the window. As the truck pulled away, the setting sun threw a long orange bar across the road. For a fraction of a second, I saw her silhouette on the asphalt, headless. Then the shape completed itself, as if corrected by an unseen hand. The tow truck turned the corner, and the moment ended. I drove home with the radio off, letting silence do what it does. There's a distinction between fear and awareness. Fear is loud and sharp-edged. Awareness is quieter, a gradual widening of the circle around a thought until you can no longer pretend it occupies a small space. I was drifting toward that larger circle, and I didn't like it. That week, Alvarez asked for a meeting. He closed the office door with unnecessary gentleness. He said he'd been reviewing the dashcam footage from our old highway case for training purposes and had noticed that, for about 2 frames, the floodlight glare washed out the area around the body almost completely, as if the light couldn't quite settle. He didn't say shadow. Neither did I. We talked instead about camera bloom, sensor limitations, common artifacts. All of it true, none of it enough. Before he left, he hesitated at the doorway and said, "Do you remember that day the way I do?" I told him that memory was slippery by design. He nodded, relieved or disappointed. I couldn't tell which. I started keeping small index cards in my pocket. Harmless things. Notes about dates, weather, call types. A tether to the measurable world. When the mind begins to mistrust itself, documentation becomes a form of prayer. If you write something down, you anchor it to a moment. Or you think you do. One afternoon, during a school crossing detail, a boy dropped his backpack and pencils spilled everywhere. We knelt together, gathering them up. The sun was bright, almost rude after so many months of restraint. The boy laughed, apologizing for the mess. I noticed, without meaning to, that in the shadow cast by his arm, the pavement seemed a half-shade lighter than it should have been, not darker. Just a whisper of contradiction. Then he stood, shouldered the pack, and ran to catch his friends. The light behaved itself again. I stood there longer than necessary, letting the stop sign hang forgotten at my side. It occurred to me then that what unsettled me was not the strangeness itself, but the absence of consequences. The world continued seamlessly. Dinner was cooked. Bills were paid. Kids went to school. And within that perfect continuity, small laws of perception failed occasionally and then corrected, like a sentence rewritten so quickly most readers would never know the first draft existed. If it was only me noticing, that was one kind of isolation. If others noticed too, but chose not to speak, that was another. The dead man's wife came in a final time. She said, very politely, that she wanted to thank us for our work. Her voice was steady, but it had the hollow timbre of someone who had spent too much time listening for footsteps that would never return. I offered the usual condolences, the practiced sincerity that is sincere precisely because it is practiced. As she turned to go, the late afternoon light through the lobby windows cast her shadow long across the tile. I watched it, not rudely, but with a concentration I couldn't hide. For a beat, the silhouette at the floor's edge did not quite match the tilt of her head. Then it did. She stopped, as if she'd forgotten something. She looked back at me with a faint, searching expression. I had the odd feeling that she, too, had seen the misalignment, but neither of us could name it. She opened her mouth, then closed it, and left. That night, I sat at the dining room table with the lights low, drinking tea that had gone cold. My wife worked on paperwork of her own, the rustle of pages a soft, domestic sound. The lamplight on the table pooled in warm yellow. My shadow rested across the wood grain, detailed and obedient. I traced the outline of my hand in the dark shape with a fingertip, like a child. For a long while, everything stayed perfectly ordinary. Then, in the space of a blink, the shadow of my hand did not move when I did. My physical hand lifted. The shadowed hand remained a fraction of a second longer, still resting on the table. Then it snapped to catch up. No drama. No spectacle. Just a small, undeniable delay between cause and effect. I set my real hand back down very gently, as though abruptness might make things worse. My wife didn't notice. The house breathed around us, quiet and benign. I realized then that I had been waiting for some grand revelation, an event dramatic enough to justify the dread that had been collecting. But there would be no such moment. Instead, there were 1,000 small betrayals of expectation, spread thin across days that otherwise behaved. The horror, if that's the word, lay in the competence of the world to continue untroubled. I slept poorly that night. In dreams, I walked along the highway shoulder beneath a sky without stars. My shadow kept to the center line like a separate traveler, patient and silent. When I woke, I couldn't decide whether the dream had disturbed me or comforted me. Either way, I went to work. That's what you do. A few days later, I received a call from Dr. Hahn asking me to stop by. He didn't elaborate. When I arrived, he closed his office blinds, a gesture of privacy that did not feel ominous so much as considerate. He said he'd been reviewing some lab security footage for unrelated reasons and had noticed brief moments when he himself appeared in frame without a corresponding darkness on the tile. "It's probably nothing," he said calmly. "But it keeps happening." He spoke the way professionals do when they refuse melodrama on principle. We sat there a moment, not looking at each other, two rational men on either side of a space that had quietly widened. We agreed on nothing, decided nothing, and parted with mutual courtesy. Outside, the afternoon light lay soft across the hospital lot. Cars cast tidy replicas of themselves on the asphalt. The world was, once again, in order. I stood there long enough to watch the shadows lengthen, just to make sure they did. By late spring, the roads had shed their winter skin, leaving behind patched asphalt and the ghosted outlines of salt. Tourists began to pass through again, couples in rental cars bound for the mountains, RVs towing small domestic lives behind them like shells. The county exhaled a little. Green returned to the ditches. Birds stitched the early mornings together with sound. All the pieces of normal life slotted back into place. If you'd asked me then, I would have said honestly that things were fine. Inside that answer, another truth waited quietly. There is a peculiar fatigue that comes from doubting your own senses. You don't feel frightened so much as eroded. Every observation requires a second pass. I became careful in ways that didn't show. I lingered in rooms just long enough to confirm that the way light fell stayed stable. I reread incident reports with an eye for invisible edits. I found myself hesitating slightly before writing certain words: shadow, reflection, silhouette, as though they might acquire a different meaning if I pressed too hard on them. Around that time, one of our older deputies, Harris, announced his retirement. We held a small ceremony in the meeting room: coffee in paper cups, a sheet cake from the grocery store with green frosting spelling out his name. The room was filled with that subdued affection men sometimes have for one another, expressed mostly through jokes. Harris made a brief speech. Nothing sentimental. He said he'd miss the work but not the midnight calls. Everyone laughed. I stood near the back, listening. The fluorescent lights hummed. As Harris spoke, I noticed the shadows on the wall behind him, row upon row of them. Each one matched a deputy at the table, heads and shoulders outlined on the cinder block like a roll call. Except for one. The place where my shadow should have been showed only the faint, egalitarian gray of the wall itself. I blinked. The moment stretched, and then the darkness reassembled itself, fully compliant, rising up my outline like ink filling a shape. No one reacted. I kept my face composed. When the cake was cut, I shook Harris's hand and wished him well. He looked at me with a surprisingly searching expression, as if he wanted to say something small and private, then thought better of it. "Take care of yourself," he said. It was ordinary enough. I nodded, grateful for the benign script. That evening, after the office had emptied, I sat at my desk with the window open to the soft air and took inventory of what I knew, which wasn't much. People disappeared briefly from frames. Shadows lagged. Light lost its nerve, then found it again. None of it left bruises or broken glass. None of it could be quantified. But the accumulation of small discrepancies began to feel like being followed by a story that refused to introduce itself. I thought again about the first night, the body lying in the stellate light of the patrol car, and I found, to my quiet alarm, that the details were continuing to shift. In my memory, sometimes his jacket was green, sometimes navy. Sometimes his boots showed salt lines, sometimes they didn't. What stayed constant was the absence of any dark companion at his side. That part never softened, never blurred. One afternoon, I stopped by the reservation substation to drop off some paperwork. The officer on duty, a woman named White Feather, brewed coffee as we talked. She's a measured person, comfortable with silence. At one point, unprompted, she said, "Elders have been saying the light's been acting odd lately." She said it without drama, the same way someone might comment on drought. Not bad, just odd. Then she moved on to other topics. She didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask. The respect between us included the right to keep certain stories unvoiced. On the way back, I parked at a rest area overlooking a wide sweep of land where the prairie softened into timber. The sky was a thin, washed-out blue. People came and went, stretching their legs, throwing away fast food bags. Each one cast a small, dark proof of their presence on the concrete. I watched for a long time and saw nothing unusual. Eventually, I stopped waiting for something to misbehave and drove back to town. That night, I dreamt of the morgue hallway, long and sterile, overhead lights receding forever. I walked, and with each step my shadow fell a fraction farther behind, like a tired companion. When I turned to look for it, there was only the polished floor stretching back into brightness. I woke with the feeling you get when the phone rings late, that hollow premonition in the chest. I found myself thinking more often about what it means to witness. People come to law enforcement looking for confirmation that what they experienced happened the way they remember. We provide it when we can. We knit the seams in a story so it can be carried without cutting the person who must hold it. But what do you do when the seams begin to come loose in your own account of the world? Mary from dispatch mentioned, with a quick laugh, that the office cat had taken to staring at empty corners as if someone were standing there. "You ever see animals do that?" she asked. I said yes. Animals do plenty we don't understand. She nodded, relieved by the simplicity of the answer. I walked back to my office and closed the door. I'm not a superstitious man. I believe in the stubbornness of facts. So I began to test small things in secret. I would place my hand flat on the wall at certain hours and watch the edge of the darkness it created. I would stand at attention beneath the flagpole at dusk and let the lowering sun decide what to do with me. Most of the time, everything behaved. Sometimes, it didn't. One evening, I parked my cruiser on a ridge overlooking town. The lights below made a scatterplot of habitation. Porch bulbs, street lamps, the bright, steady glare of the gas station. From up there, the world looked ordered and complete. I stepped out and stood with my hands in my pockets. The last light slid along the horizon, and for a few breaths there were no shadows at all. The land and the people on it existed without dark translation. Then, with night, the shapes returned. I realized in that moment that the real dread came not from the possibility that something strange was happening, but from the certainty that nothing would be done about it. There would be no press conference, no interagency task force, no official acknowledgement that the small machinery of perception had begun, occasionally, to grind. The world would simply continue, reasserting its benign narrative. And inside that narrative, a few of us would carry the quiet knowledge that the edges no longer lined up. The dead man's name still sits at the top of a file in my drawer. I open it from time to time, not to solve anything, but to remind myself that on a particular winter night, under the witness of 2 deputies and a confused motorist, a body lay by the roadside and failed to cast a shadow. Everything else might be in dispute. Not that. I found a kind of uneasy peace with it. I do my job. I drive the roads. I nod to neighbors in grocery aisles. I listen when people tell me their worries, both legitimate and imagined. And in the background, like a low, unceasing hum, I remain aware of the fragile agreement between light and matter, and of the odd, occasional failures of that agreement. Some days, I believe it will resolve. We'll find the trick of physics or perception that explains everything away. Other days, I suspect that what's broken isn't the world, but my ability to rest comfortably inside it. Most days, I simply keep going. Summer approaches slowly here, like someone edging into a cold lake. The mornings remain cool, the afternoons briefly convincing, and the evenings uncertain again. By May, the roads hummed with traffic, and the school year wound down into field days and graduations. If there was a center to all that quiet instability I'd been noticing, it didn't announce itself. It simply continued, threading through otherwise ordinary days. People came to me with small concerns that had nothing to do with shadows. A farmer thought someone had been walking his fields at night. A store owner asked for advice about a shoplifter. A mother worried about her son's friends. Real problems, rooted in the tangible, with consequences you could point to and address. I found reassurance there. I could help with those. But the ledger in my mind went on keeping its quiet accounts. One afternoon, I responded to a call at the senior center. A resident had fallen in the hallway. When I arrived, the paramedics had things well in hand. The woman, 82, cheerful despite the embarrassment, insisted she was fine. I stayed to take down the details, more out of habit than necessity. The corridor was bright with late daylight. As the gurney rolled past, I noticed that all the residents in the common room were watching, not with anxiety, but with a kind of solemn attention. Every one of them had their face turned toward the door, like flowers to the sun. Later, one gentleman, sharp as a tack despite the years, asked me whether I'd ever noticed that people seemed to drag a little behind themselves lately. He said it kindly, conversationally, as if it were an idle musing about the weather. Just a feeling, he added, dismissing it. I nodded and made some non-committal sound. When I left, I paused in the lobby and studied the chairs, the potted plants, the framed photos of past events. All perfectly normal. Then, as a resident crossed the floor with a walker, I thought, only for a blink, that her shadow's hands did not grip the handles. A beat later, they did. I drove back to the office with the window cracked, the smell of warming earth rising from the ditches. I tried to imagine a version of events where nothing was happening except inside my head. It wasn't a frightening idea. If anything, It was relieving. I could accept being the unreliable narrator of my own life. What I struggled with was the idea that the world itself might occasionally misplace a detail and keep going as if it hadn't. A week later, the reservation police asked us to assist with a search along the river. A kayaker had found a jacket snagged on a branch near a quiet, meandering stretch. We worked alongside them, walking the banks, checking bends and backwaters. The river was a slow brown ribbon, the surface broken by the low hum of insects and the flash of fish near the shallows. Search work demands focus, which I welcomed. Toward evening, we found the man a mile downstream, cold but alive, huddled under a fallen cottonwood. Disoriented, dehydrated, but intact. He said he'd lost track of where he was and simply sat down to rest. No heroic story. No sinister detail. Just the slow attrition of circumstance. We walked him back to the vehicles, giving him water, keeping our questions gentle. As we moved, I watched our shapes slip in and out of the trees. In the shifting dapple of light through leaves, shadows break and reform constantly. It's the nature of sunlight filtered through branches. And yet there were moments, brief, easily denied, when the man we escorted seemed to walk without any dark companion at all, as though the forest had declined to record his presence. Each time it corrected itself almost immediately. Each time, I pretended I hadn't noticed. That night, I stopped by the office to finish paperwork. The building after hours is a different animal, breathing, settling, making its small mechanical noises. I sat alone, writing by the glow of a desk lamp. The rest of the room lay in comfortable darkness. At some point, I realized I'd been staring not at the page but at the shadow that spread from the lamp's base across the blotter. It occurred to me that I could, if I chose, describe all of this in a report. A factual, restrained account of anomalies in perception and light. I imagined how it would read. Then I imagined the hands that would receive it. And I set the pen down. The church across the street holds a rummage sale each June. The parking lot fills with card tables covered in old crockery, puzzles with missing pieces, and the kind of lamps people inherit without ever wanting to. I walked through on a Saturday morning, nodding to neighbors. The sun was kind that day, casting warm rectangles across the asphalt. For a moment, surrounded by chatter and the smell of hot dogs, I felt almost normal again. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a small girl skip across the lot. Her body moved in lively, irregular bursts. Her shadow moved in one smooth line, half a heartbeat behind. I watched until she vanished behind a table stacked with paperback novels. Her parents laughed at something the pastor said. I felt a slow, thoughtful calm wash over me. Not acceptance, exactly. Just the recognition that whatever this was, it had no interest in spectacle. It threaded itself through the everyday. I began to understand something then, not about the cause, but about the shape of the experience. It wasn't that reality had split into two versions. It was that reality had gained a thin seam, like a hairline crack in glass. Light entered that seam sometimes. Memory did, too. And those of us unlucky or lucky enough to notice simply had to live with that knowledge. Alvarez stopped by my office one afternoon, leaned in the doorway, and said, "Do you ever feel like the world is proofreading itself?" He laughed as soon as he said it, as if to soften the strangeness. I didn't laugh. I asked him what he meant. He shook his head. "Never mind. I'm tired." We talked about schedules, training, vacation time, ordinary things. But as he left, he glanced at the wall, at the place where his outline rested. It was there. It was always there. Mostly. The file on the winter death remained in my drawer. I began to open it less. Not because it troubled me more, but because it troubled me less. The event had become one bead on a long, invisible string of similar moments. The shock had faded, replaced by a kind of contemplative respect, the way you regard an old scar. Sometimes, driving the empty highways at night, I would switch off the radio and let the darkness settle all around. The patrol car's beams carved a narrow corridor ahead of me. Within that corridor, the world existed fully. Beyond it, perhaps it did too. Perhaps not. Either way, my duty remained the same. Respond when called, bear witness, do the proper paperwork. And in the quieter spaces between calls, acknowledge, if only to myself, that occasionally the light forgets us, and occasionally memory does too, and that both return in their own time, without apology. I don't know what any of it means. I suspect that's the point. June settled in with long evenings that seemed reluctant to end. The light lingered over the fields like a guest who can't quite bring themselves to leave. By then, whatever had begun that winter had woven itself so thoroughly into my days that I no longer thought of it as separate. I didn't wait for the world to behave strangely. I simply noticed when it did. Early in the month, a call came in about a suspicious person behind the high school gym. A custodian had seen someone standing by the dumpsters at dusk and then, when he went to check, found the space empty. That alone was nothing unusual. People come and go. But he sounded rattled in a way I'd learned to recognize, a quiet tremor beneath otherwise ordinary words. I drove over. The gym sits at the edge of town, surrounded by chain-link fencing and a scatter of utility sheds. The sky was the warm pink of a long evening drifting toward night. I walked the perimeter with my flashlight, checked doors, found everything secure. When I stood still, I could hear the hum of the sodium lights and the soft rustle of wind in the grass. The custodian, a thoughtful man named Sawyer, met me by the loading dock. He apologized for what he called bothering us over nothing. I told him that if something didn't feel right, it wasn't nothing. He nodded, relieved. Then he said, almost shyly, that the reason it bothered him was that, when he first saw the figure by the dumpsters, he'd noticed that it didn't seem to register properly in the light. He struggled for the word. Like the shadow stayed behind, he said finally. He looked at me as though waiting to be gently corrected. I didn't correct him. I thanked him, took a brief statement, and told him to call any time. When he left, I remained there for a while, my back against the cool cinderblock wall, watching the lengthening dusk. There were no figures, no odd movements, just the slow, steady dimming of the world. And yet, as the last light drained away, the darkness seemed to hesitate before claiming certain corners, as if waiting for permission. Driving home, I felt something I hadn't expected, not fear, not dread, something more like companionship. Not in any sentimental sense. Just the sense that this quiet instability was not mine alone anymore, if it ever had been. Other people had begun to notice, each in their own careful way. And still the town went on. Church bells. High school graduations. The muffled thump of fireworks tested in backyards earlier than they should be. One Saturday, I attended a community picnic at the fairgrounds. Kids ran among the tables with sparklers, under careful parental eyes. The sky deepened slowly. As twilight settled, the floodlights clicked on one by one, each transforming the world beneath it into a small stage. I stood by the fence line, nodding to people, answering small talk questions about county business. At some point, without thinking, I glanced down at my boots. No shadow, just the faint, even color of trampled grass. I didn't move. I didn't test it. I simply stood as the evening thickened, listening to laughter and the distant bark of a dog, watching kids draw shapes in the air with fire. After what might have been seconds or minutes, the dark shape returned, rising up from the ground like water seeping back into dry soil. Everything aligned again. I finished my conversation with a councilman about snowplow funding, shook hands, and went home. You would think that a moment like that would shatter something inside you. It doesn't. It becomes another bead on that invisible string. Another entry in a ledger you never meant to keep. I saw Alvarez less often then. Schedules had shifted, and he'd taken on more day work. When we did cross paths, he looked older than his years, not in the physical sense but in that quiet way people age on the inside. One afternoon he came into my office and closed the door. He said he was thinking of transferring to a larger department downstate, more resources, different pace. He asked if I thought it was a good move. I told him the truth, that he'd do well anywhere. He hesitated, then said, "Do you remember that body? The winter one?" "Yes," I said. He nodded, once. "I don't always," he said. "Not clearly. But when I do, I remember that it didn't cast." He didn't finish the sentence. We sat in silence for a moment. I could feel something like respect between us and something else too. An unspoken agreement not to push any further toward whatever line waited at the edge of that conversation. He changed the subject to training budgets. We discussed scheduling. The earth continued to spin. Later that week, I drove to the cemetery on the hill outside town. I go there sometimes when my head fills up. The stones are arranged in neat rows, each name a brief interruption in the grass. The family of the dead man had chosen a simple marker, just his name, the dates, a short line from a hymn. The sky was a hard, clean blue. The breeze smelled of cut hay. I stood there a while, hat in hand. I wasn't talking to him. I don't do that. I was simply standing in a place where life had made itself honest. And as I stood there, I noticed that the marble stones cast clean, sharp shadows on the ground, each one a dark echo of the shape above it. Except his. For one bare second, no longer than that, the space beside his stone held only sunlight. Then the darkness returned, neat and rectangular, exactly as it should be. I closed my eyes and let the moment pass through me. When I opened them, the world had resumed its regular order. A car passed on the road below. A bird landed on a distant cross. I put my hat back on and walked to the cruiser, feeling the sun warm the back of my neck. What do you do with a thing like that? Nothing, as it turns out. You go back to work. You answer calls. You eat dinner with your family. You sleep, sometimes better than others. And now and then, in the quiet between obligations, you remember that on a particular winter night, light failed to make a companion for a dead man, and that ever since, it has occasionally hesitated to follow the living as well. I've reached a point where I no longer look for explanations. Explanations imply resolution. I don't believe this will resolve. I think it will continue as it has, infrequent, subtle, unobtrusive. A hairline crack in the glass of reality that most people will never notice, and that those who do will choose not to mention. Not out of fear, necessarily. Just because there is nothing useful to say. Sometimes, late at night, I'll walk onto the porch and stand beneath the single bulb by the door. The moths wheel and flutter. The light pools in a familiar oval at my feet. I'll look down, and there I am, twice, once in flesh and once in graphite. The two versions line up, more or less. And on the rare occasions they don't. The difference is so small that it might as well be a trick of the eye. I've come to understand that my job was never about solving the world. It was about standing inside it with a measure of steadiness, even when it doesn't quite agree with itself. Perhaps especially then. So that's what I do. Most nights, that's enough. July arrived with heat that flattened the days into a single long exhale. Evenings stretched out, the sky lingering in muted lavender before finally darkening. Summer has a way of making the world feel complete, like a sentence with all its punctuation in place. Maybe that's why the small instabilities I'd been tracking felt less intrusive. They were still there. They simply didn't insist on being noticed. Tourists clogged the two-lane highway with campers and roof racks. The lake filled with boats. Restaurants filled with the background murmur of strangers. Our calls shifted accordingly. Lost hikers, small accidents, noise complaints. Work to do. Structure to stand inside. I don't remember a single dramatic shift, only that at some point my vigilance softened. I still noticed the occasional lag between a person and the dim shape that represented them. Reflections still seemed, once in a while, to hesitate before agreeing to show the world as it was. But I no longer braced for it. I would catch the misalignment and then watch as reality corrected itself, the way you'd watch someone straighten a crooked picture frame. A small adjustment. No fuss. One afternoon, I stopped by the grocery store on the edge of town. The automatic doors sighed open, releasing the smell of fruit and conditioned air. Inside, families debated cereals. Teenagers lingered near the freezers, cooling off. Life in its small, durable forms. I picked up a few things and lined up at the register. Ahead of me, a man I didn't recognize loaded his groceries onto the belt. Bread, a watermelon, a packet of hot dogs. The glare from the front windows cast a wide bar of light across the floor. As he stepped forward, there was a moment, barely the length of a breath, when his feet occupied the light but made no corresponding interruption in it. Then the shape returned, crisp and ordinary. He paid, thanked the cashier, and left. The cashier turned to me and asked about the weather. I said it was holding steady. We smiled. The transaction completed itself. On the drive back to the office, I thought about what it means for something to be real. We rely on repetition for proof. The sun rises. The coffee brews. Tires hum over asphalt. But when small parts of that repetition fail and immediately repair themselves, what you're left with is not fear exactly. It's a kind of abiding humility. The recognition that reality is not a fortress, it's a truce. A few days later, the widow of the Winter case came in with a donation for the Victims Assistance Fund. We stood in the lobby with the afternoon sun filtering through the glass. She looked steadier, somehow, still carrying what she carried, but also standing under it with practice. We spoke politely for a few minutes. Then, just before she left, she said something so quietly I almost didn't catch it. "I still sometimes wake up," she said, "and it takes a second for the room to remember me." She didn't wait for an answer. She gave a small, apologetic smile and walked out into the heat, the door whispering shut behind her. I stood there, the donation envelope in my hand, and I realized that whatever this was, it did not belong to me alone. It belonged to anyone who had stood still long enough to notice the thin seam running through the world. Later that month, the county fair opened. Lights spun over the midway. Music leaked from every direction. Kids ran in shrieking clusters, hopped up on sugar and heat. I walked the grounds in uniform, nodding to vendors and answering questions. Everything was loud and alive. Everything was exactly as it should be. Near the grandstand, a band tuned their instruments. People arranged folding chairs in neat, improvised rows. I stopped to buy a lemonade. The sun dropped lower, and the stage lights came up, casting bright cones across the dust. In that hard intersection of artificial light and natural evening, I saw, for a few seconds, something I'd grown used to: a group of people waiting, their bodies present and their shadows taking just a fraction of a second longer to join them. Then, just as always, the world aligned. Watching it, I felt no rush of panic, no clutching dread, just a calm, thoughtful recognition. This is how it is now, and perhaps it has always been. Maybe we simply never looked at the exact angle required to see the seam before. That night, when the fair closed and the crowds thinned, I drove the long way home. The fields glowed with the last of the day. The sky darkened in patient layers. I pulled over near the ridge, my usual place, and stepped out. The air was warm and smelled faintly of dust and sweet clover. Town lights glittered below like small declarations of human persistence. I stood there for a while without moving. No radio, no headlights, just the sound of insects and the soft rustle of grass. I looked down at the ground beside me. My shadow stood where it belonged, a dark, familiar companion. I waited. After a few seconds, it lagged, only a little, and then eased back into place. I didn't test it further. I didn't wave my arms or shine a light. I simply accepted the small misalignment the way you accept the wind changing direction or a storm skirting the edge of town. Eventually, I got back into the cruiser and drove home. I don't tell this story for effect. I don't tell it to frighten or impress. I tell it because it happened, and because it keeps happening in small ways, and because the worst thing you can do to a truth is pretend it never existed. We live inside a world that mostly holds together. That is a mercy. But every so often, the seams show. And when they do, the light behaves strangely, and memory with it. I remain the sheriff of a small county. I take calls. I go to meetings. I fill out forms. I shake hands at church functions and drink too much coffee on night patrol. I greet the sunrise through a dusty windshield more often than not. And through it all, I stay aware of the quiet agreement between the world and our perception of it. Most of the time, that agreement holds. On the days it doesn't, I bear witness, write my reports and leave a small space, just enough, to honor the part of the story that refuses to fit neatly on the page. Then I move on to the next thing. Because life, as it turns out, is very good at continuing. And the light, hesitant or not, follows. Sooner or later.